Hello, my name is Lee Vague, and I am the Police Chief and Public Safety Director for the City of Woodbury.
I'm Tim Brewington. I'm the pastor of Fellowship Church here in the beautiful city of Woodbury, Minnesota.
So, in the wake of George Floyd's killing, we thought it would be a good idea to sit down and have a conversation. And actually, when I say we thought, you urged me.
Yeah.
It's been a busy time for law enforcement, but every time I went to my email, I had a little prod and a little message from Pastor Tim saying that this is necessary and this is important. So I thank you for doing that, and here we are.
Well, thank you for agreeing to have this conversation. I think it's important that we have a real conversation about what's happening in our culture, and I appreciate you doing it.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Pastor.
Excellent. So, one of the things that trouble us in our community, when we look at the video, I'm just going to kind of go straight in.
Yeah, we're not scripting this.
No,
Go straight in.
We're going hard. I'll do the hard questions first.
That's all right. That's all right.
Go easy. So, when I saw the video of George Floyd and what happened to him, all the feelings of kind of rage and anger and to be honest, I didn't watch the entire video. I can only watch the first probably 30 seconds of it. And I know how I felt when I saw that. I'm interested of how did you feel when you saw that video? What did you see in that video?
It was probably the most vile and disgusting thing I'd ever seen. The sadness, frustration, anger, probably that comes to mind right away. Mm-hmm. On top of it, the fact that this is a police officer who's showing a complete lack of humanity for another person, and then of course you enter the part about race.
Yeah.
So it just had every element combined to just yeah, I'll be honest, I didn't watch the whole thing either.
Okay.
It was really deeply disturbing.
It's hard to see that, knowing that that person is charged to protect and serve, and to see that happen, it's
right.
difficult.
Yeah, that's the piece, which is on top of the act itself, the obligation that we have as police officers. Particularly if someone is in your custody.
Right.
Whatever the circumstances are that lead up to you taking somebody in custody, there's not many people in the country that have that legal authority to do that.
Right.
And when you have that legal authority to do that, you have this credible obligation, moral obligation and legal obligation to take care of that person.
Right.
It's as simple as that.
Speaking of obligation, there were 3 other police officers at the incident.
Right.
If they were Woodbury police officers, what would you have expected them to do in that situation?
Well, I'll start with the first officer,
okay.
which
All
is,
right.
I can't even fathom doing that to another person, and the idea of one of our officers doing it is something that doesn't really even compute with me. It's just not how you do it. It's not how we treat people. It doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, to your point, if you are a police officer, you have an obligation. Anytime if there's serious criminal activity or certainly another person hurting another person, you have an obligation to do something about that. Now, I'm going on the bit that I know of, which is probably about as much of the video as you watched, and saw at least a second officer there that was very close. I don't have a lot of information about officers 3 and 4, to be honest, but if you witness something like that happening, you need to do something. And it can come in a lot of forms. If your partner's lost his or her cool, it's as easy sometimes as just maybe tapping that person out. You can keep save face.
Yeah.
This is an extreme example, obviously, but let's just say in a less extreme example, someone loses their cool. You can save face by just taking over for them, and why don't you go over here for a little bit and stand in front of the crowd and I'll care for this. There's ways to do that are so easy and expected, and getting back to Woodbury, that's what we see. I mean, we're all human.
Sure.
You know, and so if somebody's getting to you in a different situation and getting agitated, we look after each other in that way.
Okay.
Again, this is so out of bounds and so extreme that it's really disturbing that no one would intervene, especially since you have people who are literally telling them and saying, you know, pointing out the obvious.
Right.
So it almost became a sense of, it almost felt defiant.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that was really strange.
Do you think that those officers should have stepped up and
Absolutely.
done something? Okay.
Absolutely, you have an obligation to step
Okay.
up. Again, I don't know who saw what and where they were.
Okay.
I know about what you know.
Right,
But if
right.
you're aware that this is going on, you have a moral and a legal obligation to do something.
So I'm sure there was some conversations within the department after this incident happened. Can you share with me what was the talk in the office amongst the department when that happened?
I don't know that, I've been in this business for 31 years, and I've never seen anything so universally condemned as the video that we saw. I mean, without any exception, it was the same reaction I think that you had and I had. And on the anger side, officers who just are so upset at, you know, we're connected to this inevitably through our work and what we do. There's a connection, and it's they're really mad, they're really sad. So yeah, I don't know that on that emotional reaction way that our reaction is any different than yours or anybody else's.
Okay. Well, as you can imagine, there are a lot of individuals, myself included, in the Black and brown community that saw that and are angry, sad, mad, fearful. What would you say to the community from a police department standpoint? How would you address those in the community that are angry and fearful and sad? I mean, I went from feelings of despair to rage in seconds. What would you say to?
Well, I would say we should feel angry and despair and rage and fearful and sadness. I mean, it's exactly the way we should be feeling right now. I don't know how you could be a human being and not feel all of those things. You know, I get to not feel the fear part.
Yeah.
So that part is different, obviously, but I completely understand it. I just think, you know, we've had just this very short time period that we're still very much processing all of the things you just described. Yeah. So that's where it's at right now. Yeah. I mean, I think it is for everybody, and that will, you know, those emotions, I believe, will start to hopefully change into other things, which eventually I would hope we can start getting into, okay, now what? You know, in action and change and hope. But yeah, it's where it's at.
Yeah. What impact do you think this incident will have on how Woodbury does policing?
That's a good question on how we do policing. I mean, in some respects, the incident, the technique, what happened is so out of bounds from what we do that it doesn't have that exact nexus. Okay. But it affects everything, right? I mean, this is anytime there's an incident like this, it comes back home to our community, and we know that whether it's in Ferguson, Missouri, or Minneapolis or wherever, we have people in our community that are going to be affected and are going to everything you just described. So it affects our policing in ways that we, you know, you show up to work and you're going out to try to help people, but you're realizing that the people you're trying to help might be incredibly fearful just by your presence. Yeah. It's a very strange thing if you're, you know, when you're coming to work for the right reasons.
Right. Well, how do you all address? Let me rephrase my question. If you, as a department, identify an officer that has some biases or some tendencies to show some type of inequity in policing? How is that? How do you identify that officer, and then how is that issue addressed?
Well, so I'll approach this with starting point of bias is part of our human condition.
Sure.
I have bias, you have bias.
Absolutely.
Every police officer has bias, everybody has bias.
Yeah.
So to think that people don't have bias or that a police officer is that's not realistic. They're going to have it. So where we do our training and where we well, first of all, we pick the best possible people.
Okay.
And we do thorough background investigations and psychological examinations. Okay. And you know, when you've got a department that's got a good culture, we have the privilege of being able to recruit people, even sometimes from other places, from other departments, because we got a pretty good thing going. Okay. We're not perfect, but we've got a good thing going. So it starts with that. It starts with getting the best people possible, selecting them. It starts with putting them into a culture that, and it's been this way ever since I worked here and before I worked here, which is you have to trust your partners. You have to know they're going to do the right thing, and a culture of accountability. So that's that basis. And then when we get to individual people, we acknowledge every person has bias. So what do we do with that? So what it really is about is getting people to understand what bias is, getting to understand what are your triggers, what are the things that that you're dealing with as a human being, and then what are the impacts of those biases on this job? Because this is a pretty, this isn't your normal job where, if somebody's biased in a job that's, not affecting people's civil liberties, you may not notice it as much, but this is such a big part of it. So we train on this and we talk about what bias is and we dig into what bias is, and then we talk about our unconscious biases. Mm-hmm. What are the things beneath the surface that, because, it's not I'm not a racist, okay, good, but I mean, we see it play out in, outside law enforcement with people who probably consciously would say that, and yet now maybe are in interaction with a black person and all of a sudden they're afraid or whatever it is and they're calling the cops, right?
Right.
So there's that unconscious bias piece as well. This is a little example, but we have one of our officers who works a lot of retail. We have a lot of retail in town. There's retail crime. And his thing is if he's in a retail area and he's watching somebody that he thinks is suspicious, his little trick that he'll ask himself and his squad would be, if this was an 80-year-old white woman, would I still be watching this person?
Right.
And if the answer is yes, proceed.
Okay.
I don't know where he came up with that.
Okay.
But I mean, it's just one little example. So, does that cop have bias? He's a human, of course. Can he work through that bias and recognize it and make sure that then his actions treat people equitably and that he's doing his job the right way? Yeah, it's possible.
You mentioned training in your response. Talk to me about how the officers are trained in de-escalation. So we've identified we have these implicit biases and we can manage that. But then outside of that, what's the training like for de-escalation and taking folks into custody?
So we do quite a bit of training. When I started, we called it use of force training, which kind of leads you a little bit, right?
Yeah, okay.
Right? But that's what we called it, and I didn't really even think anything of it. And now we look at it as, not only de-escalation, but our response perhaps to someone's resistance, or it's just a different way. And, I don't mean to get, it's not about the labels of those, it's the philosophy. It starts, again, with people who are coming to work for the right reasons and wanting to help people. And then inevitably, this is a line of work where bad things are going to happen. We are going to get called into the worst possible situations on people's worst days. It's part of the job. So I think traditionally, historically, going back, there's been too much of an emphasis in law enforcement that we got to fix things now. Get in, fix it. And when that's the primary objective, you can do it wrong, you can do it poorly, and so I think what we've seen more recently in the last few years is, yes, there's dynamic situations, but sometimes even those very dynamic situations, really walking things back and de-escalating it, not thinking about, okay, if they're doing this, I do this. That's how I was trained long ago, that use of force kind of ladder thing. Well, of course, I don't want to get hurt. you know. But I found out pretty quickly in my career, I'm not the biggest, strongest guy in the world.
Yeah.
And my best way to deal with people is exactly what you're saying. And I didn't think of it as a de-escalation technique. It's just talking to people and just trying to get people to calm and listen, create that little, not only a physical space, but just space. And so we've had that philosophy for a long time. I think in the last few years is when the training around that has become a lot more specific and a lot more scientific as far as how does that work with a human brain? How do we get people to de-escalate? Okay. And when are the times that, yeah, it's got to be dynamic and quick? When are the times we can just step back? Sometimes it's okay to just step back.
Yeah.
We're not going to fix every problem.
Right.
But we've figured out, this is a simple statement, you don't have to rush in and fix every problem. Sometimes, literally, we can just walk away.
Okay. Talk to me about the recruitment process for the police officer, and is there any specific plan to increase minority recruitment for the Woodbury Police Department?
There is. So the city of Woodbury, going back, gosh, I think it was maybe 5 years ago or more, we joined a group called GARE, it's Government Alliance for Racial Equity. And it wasn't just about policing, it's about city government, county government, state government, kind of getting people together, like-minded, to try to figure out some of these issues. So I was in one of our first classes that went through. It was really interesting. We learned a lot. And I'm getting a little off track here with your question, but it was kind of a starting point for us to kind of learn about the idea of what racial equity means with all the things that we do, our planning, our policies, our everything, because we hadn't really done that before.
Okay.
You know, we're experts in our field and we always try to make the right decisions, but I can't say that when I would put together a policy, for instance, on body-worn cameras, I didn't say, Pastor Tim, what does this look like to you? How does this affect you?
Yeah.
We didn't do that. So part of it is just figuring that out.
Actually, you did.
We did do that.
In my case, yes.
Well, so there's the example. We
Right.
did do that, but before that we didn't. You know,
Yeah.
Fair enough. We absolutely did.
You did, so give yourself credit.
We've
for that.
learned, yeah. But before, years ago, that just wasn't a lens that we necessarily used. It was more just like, well, we'll treat everybody equally or treat everybody good. And it's like, well,
it
more to it
hasn't
than
worked
that.
out too well.
Right.
Yeah.
So for recruiting, again, we're in a pretty good position here that we have people that want to come work for us. And the number one thing we do to recruit people is word of mouth from the officers. They talk to each other. Is this a good place to work? Is this how you want to work? I remember specifically why I wanted to work here. It's just because people were treated well. They treated me well. They treated everybody well. I thought, well, that sounds like a good place to start, you know? So did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
But honestly, the recruiting thing has changed dramatically just in the last week.
Okay.
2 weeks ago, we were frontline heroes, right? COVID, when that was our thing, and all of a sudden it started feeling, okay, we're in a good place again.
Right.
After Ferguson, now we're frontline heroes, and I've seen this through my career where this has ebbed and flowed from Rodney King to 9/11 to Ferguson to frontline heroes, and here we are with George Floyd's death. So.
I think that ebb and flow that you talk about kind of speaks to this inherent and historical distrust between the police department and communities of color. What is Woodbury doing to bridge the gap between the police department and communities of color?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that we are a part of that.
Yes.
It's easy to disconnect yourself from that, especially in a community that's relatively young, and to go, well, that was this piece of history we have, but that's not who we are. And while that isn't who we are as a department and as people, we're part of this long history. So it's acknowledging that it's not enough to even just say that. So what are we going to do better? That hurt and that pain and that history is in our community. It's living in our community. The same people that are calling us for help are feeling that. So we have to make sure we not only are aware of that, but that we adjust how we do things. It's not doing everything equally with everybody. Yeah. If I'm stopped in my car, I'm not feeling the same fear, I'm going to bet, that you are.
Absolutely.
So it's adjusting and it's acknowledging that, and it's and honestly, I'm talking a lot. It's listening. We need to listen.
Yeah.
You know, and so we're had COVID not happened, we would have this thing up and running, but we're putting together our multicultural committee. And the scope of that is bigger than just race, but really trying to make sure that everybody that underrepresented people in our community are heard. That's it. And getting people of various diversity to come together and be represented, because it is about learning about each other and conversation. But for us, it's going to be a lot of listening. You know, I think we tend to want to just like explain everything. Now, I hate this, like, well, I hate when people use the term the narrative. You know, the narrative is this. No, just it's not a narrative.
I think there's been a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. And I saw a quote earlier today that says, "What we are not seeking agreement, we're seeking understanding." And so. We're not going to agree, but we at least want you to understand what it's like to be in our shoes, to feel this fear, whether we're doing something wrong or not. If we're in a car and the police comes behind us, immediately, hands where they're supposed to be. Do I have my ID? Am I not speeding? And just hearing that is important for us. Also, part of the challenge in our community is that we have not heard enough white people in power speak out against the clear wrongs that are done to communities of color. And so I think starting this conversation with the acknowledgement piece, we often hear a lot about healing and reconciliation, but if we don't acknowledge the hurt that was imposed, and if we don't call the thing what it is, if we don't call what happened to George murder, then the healing process is going to be difficult from our end because we're not calling it out for what it really is. So when a citizen, and I appreciate the Multicultural Advisory Committee and the work that's being done there, when a citizen has an issue or a concern about a police officer, what's the process of them? What do they do? How do they express that concern? Who do they go to share that with?
So we have people that express concerns, you know, about various things with our police officer, and we have a process, and it can be as formal or as informal as is needed. I think this is such a hard thing to explain, because if you don't trust us and you don't trust me and you think it's just the system is rigged, then my next 3 sentences aren't going to mean a whole heck of a lot. All I can speak for is what I know and what I've seen in my time here in Woodbury, which is we don't think we're perfect. We make mistakes. If we make mistakes, we'll own our mistakes, and we want to improve. So even beyond complaints, every single use of force of any kind, I mean, any time that you're putting hands on somebody, anything more than just a simple handcuffing, if there's any type of technique that's used, gets written up with a report. It gets reviewed, and it gets reviewed again every single time. Now, some of it is because we want to learn and we want to improve and obviously we want to track ourselves and hold ourselves accountable.
Does the public have access to those reports?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these are the conversations we have to have. Nobody generally asks, right?
Okay.
And there's no reason. There's public parts of that we absolutely can do.
Okay.
I think people would be surprised to know we don't have a lot of use of force. There's very few that happen throughout the course of a year, and of the few that do happen, most of them are very basic things where somebody pulls away and they resist and they got to handcuff somebody. So we review all of those. So not only to improve ourselves for training, but to your point much earlier in this conversation, what if somebody is going off the rail? If you've got somebody who's not doing the right thing, we need to be able to track that. Anybody who calls us that has a concern or a complaint against an officer, we're going to take it seriously. The usual way is it's by phone. They call the dispatch. They'll talk to a sergeant. That sergeant's going to he or she's going to pull the needed reports. We've got body-worn camera, video squad, whatever it is, they're going to put that thing together, and they're going to make that initial analysis based on the complaint. And sometimes I feel this person was rude to me. I was on a traffic stop and they stood behind me, and whatever it may be. We'll look into it. And so we look into each and every one of those complaints. It gets, if it's something that we then say it's a policy violation or there's a problem that this is an issue, it gets assigned to an administrative investigation.
Okay.
It's overseen by our commander. They go through the whole thing, then it goes to me, and I personally see every one of them.
Okay.
And I can count on one hand how many of these we would ever get in a year.
Okay.
So we don't get a lot of complaints against officers. We don't have a lot of use of force in general that we have. We're very lucky in that regard.
Okay.
But if somebody has a problem with us, we'll take care of it. Sometimes it's just people that are, they want to talk about their experience with us.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand why, what happened? Why were there two cops at my door?
Okay.
Or I was in a car, I was stopped. Well, there's things that transpire. So we'll do our very best to kind of figure out what those are, and we'll sit down and I've done this many times. We'll sit down and we'll talk about it. And again, we don't always agree.
Sure.
But we listen and we learn.
Okay. Next question related to that. So what's the process if an officer has concerns about another officer in the department? What's the culture behind?
Yeah, that whole blue thing, right?
Yeah, that's a concern. that we
Yeah.
have.
Well, the process that plays out is a pretty human process, which is if you've got an issue with somebody, typically it's dealt with one-on-one. We have pretty amazing ability now to monitor the activities of our police officers more than we have ever had before. It has to start with trust, though.
Mm-hmm.
They still have a lot of discretion. They're out and about. But if you see someone who's got a problem, you're going to talk to them, and it would be an expectation that if it's a problem, like we're talking about here, like they're not treating somebody equitably, they're not treating somebody fairly, the expectation is you would talk to that person's sergeant and that supervisor.
Okay.
So, and again, we're not perfect. There's going to be times any human being can have a bad moment and lose their cool.
Right.
Anybody, maybe they say something that's rude or a bad word or whatever it may be, we'll deal with it.
Right.
But I think there's a fear that once you get in the ranks, there's just no accountability.
Mm-hmm. That's the fear.
And I can't speak for everywhere.
Okay.
But I look at our results. I look at every day how people are treated. I look at all of the good things that are happening, and I know that accountability is still there.
Okay. I want to go back because I think you answered this question, but I want to make sure I understand. Is there a way for a citizen to find out how many complaints have been leveraged against a particular officer or the department? Like, is there an annual report that I can look at and say, okay, it seems like there's an increase in these?
So the report that we file right now is with the Post Board,
Okay.
right? And that's a public report. But what I'm hearing you say is make it accessible, make it easier. And we can do that. That's not a problem.
Okay.
We generally aren't asked for it.
Okay.
And it's a pretty short report.
Okay, that's good.
Which is
Okay.
good. But
Yeah.
that's no problem.
Okay.
We can, and again, I'm not going to pretend I'm public data practice expert
Right,
here, because
right.
we have people who are, but the things that are public, we absolutely, we can be more transparent
Okay.
about that. Absolutely,
Okay,
and
I
should be.
think that
That's
helps.
pretty easy.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Here's my last question. Right. What do you want the communities of color to know about the Woodbury Police Department? What do we not understand about who you are, how you all operate? What do we need to know?
I think what you need to know is, for starters, if we're going to talk about, and I'll say it, the murder of George Floyd, if we're talking about that you have men and women that serve you every day that are feeling the same anger and sadness and frustration around his death. And that we have seen something happen that is so completely out of bounds of what anyone should do as a human being, let alone as a police officer. And it's given us yet another moment to reflect and to pause about what we do every day and the service that we provide. And what I can tell you about the people that do the job in Woodbury is these are people who are here for the right reasons. We're human, but we are family members and dads and moms and brothers and sisters and community members who believe in what we do and believe that the service we provide is absolutely essential and fundamental to all of us if we're going to live our lives with liberty and in the right way. So that's how we come to work.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say this right now, but we're proud of what we do. We're proud of our department. We're proud of the work we do. And we want, particularly with people of color that live in our community, to know that while my words right now may not be very impactful, and you can, and I understand the distrust and the fear, we are here continually to prove who we are and that we're here to serve every single person in the community. You know, it's not by chance that our city council said this is important, that a welcoming community is one of the number one priorities we have to do. And while that's not just about policing, while all of this really isn't just about policing, because we're talking about this long history of systemic racism, we're kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? With everybody. So we're the ones, inevitably, if you're going to have government in your life, we're probably the ones.
Absolutely.
So we do bear that additional responsibility to do it right.
Okay.
And we got to do it right every time. You know, that's the thing. You know, I mean, it's not a, it's, you know, there's so many quotes and things we've heard over the last few years.
Yeah.
But I thought this was really good, and it is Chris Rock, so I'm just going to say that. Okay.
All right.
But it was perfect because he's talking about, because a lot of people say, well, there's always some bad apples.
Yeah.
There's just a few bad apples. And well, however he put it, he's like, you know, put that in the context of a pilot. You know, most of our pilots are able to land the plane, right? But we've got a few bad apples.
Right.
That's not good
No,
enough.
not at all. Right.
And so to be really serious, because I think it makes a serious point, that's not good enough. We have to make sure that everybody that puts our badge on and holds their hand up at the beginning of their career and swears to serve everyone and protect everyone does it with equity, does it with humanity, and does it with compassion. And that's our expectation. That's who we are. That's why we love doing what we do. And that, from our piece of this, is what helps us get through these really, really terrible times. That's got to be our first contribution. But it's just the one step.
Yeah, I think it's an important first necessary step, with more steps to follow. But I appreciate your time today and you expressing your position on what happened with George Floyd. I thank you for your honesty and your candor with kind of what you've been wrestling with as you saw what we saw, and your willingness to hear us, to hear what's in our hearts. And I appreciate the work you're doing here with Woodbury, so thank you.
Thanks for doing this, and you have my word that the work you speak of will continue. This is ongoing work. We've got so much to do.
Yeah.
You're right. It doesn't just get to healing next, but we're going to be doing a lot of listening.
Yeah. The acknowledgement piece has been missing for so many years, and it's one thing for our community to say it. It's another thing for your community to say it, and I thank you for saying it.
We're saying
today.
it.
Thank you for saying it.
Thanks, Pastor Tim.
I appreciate it.
All right.
All right.